They called him a miser, the way people name a storm, sure of its danger, certain of its shape from a distance. In Copper Creek, the word carried the weight of a verdict. Caleb Hawthorne kept his doors bolted and his granaries full, polished his silver until it flashed like accusation, and moved through town with a retinue of ledger books and watchful men. Children were taught to hush when a Hawthorne name was spoken. Mothers crossed the market to avoid his carriage. It was easier that way. A simple story, wealth hoarded, heart hardened, fit the cracks in everyone's mind. Rosemary Fletcher had never believed in easy stories. She read faces the way other women read prayer books, slowly, by touch. Her little shop sat on the corner of Main and Elm, a low, fragrant place of earthen light and glass jars, of dried lavender and thyme, of windows steamed with pots of decoction. The bell above the door chimed like a small, hopeful thing. People came for bandages and poultices, for a salve for bent knees and a tea to quiet nightmares. She prepared each mixture with the steadiness of someone who had learned long recipes by heart, the pinch of willow bark, the careful bruising of rose petals, the way to coax scent from a stubborn root. The cedar chest under her counter held letters, seed packets, a faded photograph of a man whose absence shaped most of her days. Samuel. Samuel had been trade and trouble, and the reason a ledger at Hawthorne Trading now bore the number 300 in ink that smelled like finality. He'd written out one winter and not come back with the returns. He'd promised a share in the caravan, a ledger's worth toward Rosemary's future. Instead, he left with the trust of 2 people and the loose coins that should have been their margin. He left a debt and a silence. Town gossip said he'd taken the money and fled west to a town with fewer memories. Rosemary carried the truth differently, a small, hollow ache whenever cedar smelled of rain. The collectors who came were of the kind that softened pockets with patience and hardened faces with purpose. They did not come to beg, they came to balance a ledger. A note folded like a small accusation lay on the counter: pay or accept consequences. The men who shadowed the post that day made a practice of leaning in doorways and looking at a woman's hands. Rosemary tied the apron tighter and told herself she would not tremble. Her finances were pressed thin by necessity and tender care. She gave what books she could to the Pine Ridge School Project, half as a donation and half as a wager for the town's future. The school, a single, lean room with a stove always hungry for wood, was a thing that mattered to her more than pennies. If the chairs were scraped empty, the children would learn to walk the world with no steady place to rest their curiosity. Samuel had stolen more than coin when he fled. He'd stolen the breathable space for those small faces that learned to measure the world by repetition.
Rosemary counted the absent letters in her chest like missing teeth, and feared the sharp convenience of the collectors. Copper Creek was small enough that misfortune turned quickly into rumor. One afternoon, a man in a long coat and a hat pulled low walked into Rosemary's shop without the sound of the bell. He was broad-shouldered and moved as if gravity owed him deference. His dark hair caught the light like coal. His boots left faint smudges on the floorboards. He did not introduce himself with a name at first. The town already knew his name, and names in Copper Creek were like family portraits hung too long. They made you uncomfortable. "Miss Fletcher," he said, voice low and even. Up close, Caleb's eyes did not avoid accusation. They measured consequence. "You owe Hawthorne Trading $300. The confrontation was a thing prosaic in its cruelty. There were no theatrics, only the tilt of a ledger and the unrelenting fact of numbers. There was also the matter of the men who stood outside in the street like a shadowed argument. Caleb's men, loyal and quiet as wolves. When he left, the door chimed twice, once for entry and once for the echo of a future she could not, at that moment, manage. A week later, the arrangement was less ledger than proposition. The manner in which Caleb offered it read like a ledger inverted into a contract of skin and manner. He visited not in business hours, but in the dusk, when the shop's windows looked like lanterns. He did not send an emissary. He asked for a meeting under the roofs where her life's work burned like a hearth. "You can pay me back," he said one evening, after a pot of tea that tasted of bitter roots. "In coin, if you prefer." Rosemary had stood at the table with her palms braced, feeling the grain of the wood as if it might supply endurance. "I cannot gather $300 in coin without selling the chest in my parlor and taking the school desks apart. Those children—" "Then take another form of payment," Caleb interrupted. He surprised her by lowering his voice and speaking with a precision she wasn't prepared for. "Marry me for 1 year. Make a show. We will forestall my grandmother's plans to give my shares to the church. When the year is done, your debt is cancelled. If no one is fooled by our arrangement, I will see to it that the Pine Ridge School is accounted for." The room seemed to distill itself around that sentence. He did not look cruel. He looked like a man who had spent too many years cataloging contingencies. The offer landed with the gentle sound of something breaking and being offered at once. Rosemary's first reaction was anger, hot and immediate as the scald of tea. It rose like steam and nearly choked her, outrage at the notion that a marriage could be as cheap as ledger entries. But beneath it was the steady, slower fear that would not be banished by words, the knowledge that when men held debt like a rod, they could beat a life down.
A year could be enough to settle the collectors and set the school on sturdier beams. It could be enough to buy time for the children, whose small hands needed work to steady them for the world. A single year might also cost her dignity in a town that measured a woman's worth by the steadiness of her purse and the soundness of her reputation. Negotiation began with what remained of Rosemary's stubbornness. She would not be bought without conditions. If she was to be a plaything for Hawthorne pride, the stage at least had to be built on something that would persist. "If I appear to be your wife for a year, then Hawthorne Trading must fund Pine Ridge in full," she said, and the words came out of her like an order. She set her terms with the same precision she used when measuring herbs into a jar, steady, unflinching. Caleb listened. He rubbed his thumb along the rim of his teacup, as if smoothing the edge of a decision. "I will provide the funding," he said at last. "Half now, half after the wedding, public, convincing. You will stay in the town as my wife, and we will keep to the pretense. My grandmother must be persuaded. I will instruct my staff to speak the part." "And the debt collectors?" Rosemary asked. "They will be paid," Caleb assured. "My standing with the men who hold the town's strings remains intact. Your creditors will mark your ledger as cleared." There were clauses of human decency that neither paper nor seal could guarantee. Rosemary demanded more than coin. She demanded autonomy. She insisted on a stipulation, handed down with the bluntness of someone who had been forced into choice before and had not liked the shape of it. 1. I keep my shop and my practice. 2. I keep my name. 3. You will not interfere in my dealings unless it threatens the Pine Ridge School. 4. If at any point you or your family attempts to shame me publicly, the agreement is void. She said these things aloud, each point a small orchard planted against future appropriation. Caleb nodded to each with a gravity that suggested he had measured such stipulations before against other heads of household, other threatened legacies. The ring he offered was plain, a heavy band from Hawthorne gold, meant, he said, for his grandmother's approval rather than for devotion. Rosemary looked at it as if it were both a trap and a tool. She thought of Samuel and his lies and felt the tilt of choice again, a kind of moral arithmetic that counted children, desks, safety, and the cost of a single year. The town, being itself, took the bargain and turned it into talk. In the days that followed, the market's benches murmured with speculation. The blacksmith spat judgment, and then, under his breath, admitted that his son would be glad of the school's heating. The tailor spread his hands and pronounced that such arrangements were as old as need. The children at the school asked their teacher to explain why a marriage could be rented like a room, and why that might be a good thing. Most of them did not know how to measure the debts that had led to the transaction. They only knew that someone had decided for them that the school mattered. Rosemary's friends were fewer and quieter. Dorothy Barnes, a seamstress with nimble fingers and a laugh like a bell, came with a bundle of muslin and a plan. "You will need to look the part," Dorothy said, and meant it as kindness. She draped yards of fabric over Rosemary's shoulder, as if trying on a new way to stand. Thomas, who had worked for the Hawthorns on and off and kept his humor like a talisman, offered suggested lines for greetings and the half-steps of intimacy. Margaret Hawthorne, Caleb's aunt, was less generous with advice. She visited once, solemn as a bishop, and passed along a plate of stewed quinces while she appraised Rosemary as if she were a proposed portrait for a drawing-room wall. Margaret's glance carried the weight of family history, but it did not carry cruelty. Rehearsals began because Clara demanded them. The matriarch had been the sort of woman who measured permanence in the way she arranged things: chairs by the hearth, silver by the light of the west window, conservations saved like pressed flowers. When she heard talk of a marriage performed to preserve stockholdings, she sent for both of them with the briskness of a woman who had outlived rumor and outlived impatience. Clara was small in stature and vast in the reach of her scrutiny. She was introduced to Rosemary on a rain-silvered morning in a parlor that smelled of cedar and old books. She sat with a knitting basket in her lap and looked Rosemary up and down as if assessing the fabric of the woman.
"Do you know how to tend a table properly?" Clara asked without preamble. Rosemary blinked. "Yes, ma'am," she said. She had tended tables for markets and fed winter volunteers with stew and mended napkins until their hems were neat as confessions. It was a practical skill and a kind of intimacy. Clara's knitting needles clicked like judgments. "Then you may sit at one of ours for the rehearsal dinner. Remember that sincerity is less a posture and more a series of small acts. Do not fake the way you look at me. We are not fools." The idea of rehearsal was absurd and at the same time almost comforting in its ordinariness. They practiced entrances and hand placements, a kiss that would be both public and controlled, smiles cued for the benefit of relatives. In the evenings when the rehearsals dissolved and the house was quiet, Caleb would sit by the hearth and read from a book of ledgers, as if he could siphon his conscience into ink. Rosemary would stitch hems or grind herbs, and the two of them, bound by repudiation and agreement, found themselves sharing the small mechanics of domestic life, as if they were apprenticed to one another.
Those private rehearsals were where the first cracks in the performance began to show. Caleb's voice, which had held itself in the town like a law, softened when he spoke of the garden he had as a boy, when his hands were not yet hardened by trade. "I once grew an orchid in the West Room," he told her one night, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "It nearly killed me, tending it so carefully. I thought the house would be offended by something so delicate." "You tend gardens?" Rosemary asked, surprised by the tenderness that leaped small and unexpected between his words. "Not gardens, exactly," he admitted, "but the place taught me the difference between watching and caring." Rosemary imagined him bent in the dirt like any common man, hands in the soil, attention soft enough to coax up life. The image unsettled the neat lines the town had drawn, a miser bent over a living thing. The contradiction did something to the edges of his name. They agreed that the wedding would be at Aspen Grove, a small hollow of aspen trees on a parcel of land that had been in Hawthorne hands for decades. Aspen Grove had been used for hunts and company picnics, and then left to the slow accumulation of leaf and time. It was not romantic in the way the magazines described, with silk and ribbons. It was wild, with the light threaded through trembling leaves and the small music of a spring that waylaid few travelers. For Rosemary, it felt like a place that could be remade, something that could be given back to the town rather than kept as the family's private pleasure. "Make it look as if it belonged to the town by the time we stand at the altar," she told Caleb. "If you want to show, let it be of generosity, not of display." Caleb surprised her again. "We will restore it," he said. "You will tell me what to plant." There was something like humility in the way he asked, and admission that he had wealth, but not the prescriptions for care that made wealth humane. Work in Aspen Grove became their purgatory and their schoolhouse. They measured the ground for a walkway and debated the placement of benches with a seriousness that would have seemed comic if the stakes had not been real. The first morning she arrived with a basket of seedlings and a pair of gloves that still smelled faintly of soap. Caleb was already there, sleeves rolled, hands chalked with earth. Up close, his hands were not the varnished things of a man who spent his life counting coin. They were hands that had carried wood and leather, that had once been small enough to be bandaged by a mother's hand. They cleared brush together in a rhythm that matched the slow patience of their bargain. Rosemary bent to remove a snag of wire and found herself laughing at an old, clumsy bird call Caleb had tried and failed to mimic. He returned the laugh with something near embarrassment, his jaw loosening as if the muscles of courtesy had finally relaxed. There was a small revelation in watching him lift a log with care, set it down, and then turn to ask the name of a plant. He did not know the names of many things crucial to Rosemary's practice. He asked with the actual desire to learn. The knowledge he sought was not how to win arguments, but how to accomplish small, honest tasks. The town watched them at a distance. Children waved when they passed with wheelbarrows and buckets. The blacksmith offered a cart at a price, and the tailor mended a rope. The gossip softened into curiosity. The people who had pronounced him a miser began to find his physical generosity odd. The way he loosened coin for a child's medical needs that was before the bargain only a rumor. The way his men packed provisions and left them at the mission house. Actions are slippery things. They take on meaning only when repeated, and repetition was underway. Rosemary kept a journal, thin, leather-bound, the sort of thing she used to catalog remedies and seed lists. On the page, she wrote about the smell of aspen leaves when sunlight ran through them, about the way Caleb's voice trembled when he spoke of his grandmother, and about an old cedar chest he opened once in Aspen Grove that contained a bundle of faded ribbons. She was fond of these,
Caleb told her, fingers lifting a ribbon with a tenderness he reserved for the dead. They are her wars against forgetting. We all have them, Rosemary said. Small things we keep because memory is a kind of economy. We spend it carefully. She recorded these moments with a fidelity that made them an act of defiance. To hold on to the truth was to prevent rumor from making itself the whole of a person. The journal became a ledger in reverse, crediting the instances where kindness outweighed suspicion. In the evenings, they ate at a long, rough table Clara had insisted on setting in the grove while they worked. The table was old, its wood scored and stained, but it had the solidity of promises made with real hands. They would sit and share food Rosemary had prepared from her pantry: hearty bread, root soups, a stew with marrow and herbs. Once, when a storm chased them too early from the grove, they took shelter under a lean-to, and Caleb surprised her by handing her a bowl of soup with fingers careful enough that she felt watched in the best sense, seen as if she mattered. As the season shifted, small acts accumulated into evidence. Caleb set aside funds to replace a cracked beam in the school. He directed one of his foremen to ensure that the quarry masters would not skim the promised stone for their own pockets. He did not announce these things loudly. Instead, he arranged payments and made adjustments with the quiet of someone restoring a wrong ledger entry. Rosemary noticed and cataloged them like seeds saved for spring. It is a curious thing to be watched and to change.
The town, which had invested its imagination in the shape of a miser, found it disorienting when the outline did not hold. The gossipers adapted by making radical predictions. Either Caleb was acting a calculated repentance to secure his legacy, or he had softened into a true-hearted benefactor. People do not like uncertainty. They prefer narrative arcs tidy enough to fit on a tongue. So they told themselves both stories, until one morning the tailor's wife paused by the front of Rosemary's shop and said without malice, "I saw Mr. Hawthorne today at the mission house, giving bread to a widow's children." "And you think him less of a miser for it?" the barber asked, amused. "I think him more of a man," she said. Rosemary could not say that the change in town talk relieved her. She had agreed to the marriage to free the school, not to be redeemed by gossip. But the way people began to look at Caleb, the way they murmured less and thanked more, warmed her like a winter hearth. There were, she knew, deeper webs than gossip. Debt had woven itself into the town's fabric like roots. There were men who would not forgive a ledger error so easily. There were contracts signed when lawyers wore different collars. But for now, there was work and a plan, and, in the quiet of Aspen Grove, the slow unraveling of a reputation that had been stitched too long. Between these labors, voices of the past intruded. A telegram, or rather the copperplate delivery from the agent at the ranch, came with a note about Caleb's grandmother. Clara was not a woman to be trifled with. She had a habit of making decisions that sounded like kindness and turned into bindings. She demanded that the wedding look right, that the show be convincing. She watched them from the porch of Hawthorne House when they visited with seedlings and plans, her eyes soft as a povered coin, yet precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "You play your parts well," she told Rosemary once, and the words could have been praise or judgment. "But I will not be made a fool. I will not hand over what keeps this family from dissolving into charity." "What is it you want, ma'am?" Rosemary asked, measuring the bluntness of her question like a salve. Clara's fingers looped a strand of yarn around her knitting needle as if drawing a line through possibilities. "I want the house to remain. I want the stock to be kept from the pulpit. I want my grandson to know how to carry the weight." She looked out at the grove as if imagining a ledger open in the wind. "I want the Pine Ridge School to stand," Rosemary said. "I want the children to be warm." "You will have both," Clara said, "provided that the performance is honest." The knot of performance tightened around them with every instruction. They practiced greeting relatives at the market, a kiss to be placed precisely at the altar, the manner of speaking when the press of neighbors crowded.
It was absurd, and yet strangely civilizing. Rehearsals teach one not only how to pretend, but how to pay attention to small acts that otherwise pass unnoticed. It was in this liminal space, between artifice and care, that something close to authenticity began to appear. Rosemary found herself noticing, in these stretching weeks, the small ways Caleb changed. He began to bring her wildflowers from the grove and place them, awkward as he was, into an old jar on her workbench. He listened to her stories without interrupting. He asked her once about the cedar chest in the back room where she kept her medicinal books and the faded photograph of Samuel. "Do you miss him?" he asked quietly.
"I miss the steadiness he promised," she said, "and the fact that he broke trust. But I keep remembering the faces in Pine Ridge when I think of giving up. Mostly, I don't want the children to learn that those who are poor are unwanted." Caleb's hands curled around his cup. "There is a ledger in my head that has always measured family and value by holdings," he admitted. "It is difficult to reconcile that sort of bookkeeping with the thought of giving away what one calls one's own. But there are other accounts of care, of repair, that my grandfather never properly taught me." He did not say he regretted being a steward of a legacy built on exclusion. He did not apologize for the history that sharpened his edges. He did, however, begin to show that his decisions could be otherwise ordered. It was not a grand conversion. It was a series of small recalculations executed with intention. One evening, after a day of moving stones for a walkway in Aspen Grove, they sat at the Grove table and ate a stew Rosemary had brewed with root vegetables and a handful of herbs. The light through the aspen leaves made the table a scattering of gold. There was an ease between them that had been absent on that first night in her shop. They had developed a language of glances and a set of practiced intimacies that were both real and performed. The line between them thinned. "Do you think the town will forgive me?" Caleb asked suddenly, voice low. "If I offer them more than holding, if I try to right the old things, do you think they'll accept it?" Rosemary considered the question as if it were a seed she might plant or let go fallow. "Forgiveness is not a thing they give like a coin," she said. "It's a slow business. They will accept what you offer if it is given without spectacle and stitched with care. They are hungry for examples that prove the world can be repaired." He looked at her then with something like relief. "And you? Will you forgive me if I make mistakes? If I am clumsy in the ways I try to do right?" "You will make mistakes," she said. "We will make mistakes together." Her voice was not theatrical that night. It was the truest thing she had offered since the bargain began.
There were moments of rest as well. A letter from Thomas with a joke tucked between lines. A loaf of bread left at the shop by an unknown hand. A child at the school who learned to write his name and held the pencil like a new understanding. These small mercies kept the larger bargain from feeling like only a contract. Love, she had learned, often hid in the ordinary. And yet other things, dull and inevitable, waited in the ledger. There were rumblings in Althorn trading about the price of timber and the placement of contracts. There were men in town who watched Caleb as if waiting for a snap, an old expectation that wealth would tighten, not loosen. Rosemary had not bargained for public scrutiny beyond her choice. She had not expected the way the town would look to Hawthorne House for signs they could read as absolution. On the third month of their arrangement, as winter began to lose its hold and the first shoots of new green worried the earth, a messenger arrived with word that would complicate the arithmetic of their plan. William Foster, a foreman who contracted with Hawthorne Trading for a restoration at Silver Creek, a small bridge and a row of tenements for workers, had reported worrying signs. A portion of the scaffolding had shown fatigue. Men had been complaining about an oversight in the materials delivered. It was a small thing on paper, a crooked beam here, a cheap nail there, but small mechanical failures had a way of magnifying under the weight of a building. The foreman carried the letter folded like a compact accusation. Caleb read it, and his face tightened in a way that made Rosemary see the ledger in his eyes again, the old accounting that measured losses and gains. He folded the letter carefully and looked up at her, the familiar reserve returning like a cloud shadowing a field. "This will have to be addressed," he said. "It may be nothing, but we will send a team to inspect." Rosemary felt a cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the raw wind. She had been bargained into a union meant to shelter the school and to restore Aspen Grove. She had not been signed into an arrangement that would require her to be witness to the inner mechanics of Hawthorne Ventures. And yet the town's safety and the school's fate were now linked in ways that would not respect the neat boundaries she had attempted to draw. For the first time since the bargain, Rosemary felt truly afraid, not of the debt collectors, not of the small humiliations, but of the possibility that the man whose name had befallen the town's scorn might be the center of a collapse that would ripple outward like a wave. She had seen how a single broken promise could wither an entire community, Samuel's betrayal being the most intimate lesson. Now the ledger's old entries threatened to reach out their cold hands again. Caleb folded the letter and set it on the table between them.
"I will go," he said, "and I will not let anyone be hurt because of my office."
"You will not go alone," Rosemary said, though it was more a plea than a decision. "We will go together. If anything goes wrong, the town will not know only the name of Hawthorne, they will know the people who worked and suffered." He considered this for a long minute. The man who had once proposed a marriage of convenience now weighed the cost of stepping into danger for others in a way that made the air between them taut. He met her eyes, and in them she saw not only calculation, but an alarmed desire to be better than the sum of his inheritance. "Very well," he said, and his voice held something like commitment. They set out, not yet knowing how the ledger's loose entries would settle. As they walked toward Copper Creek that afternoon, the town's single bell calling men home, they carried with them not only seed and spade, but the thin, stubborn hope that the repair of a grove might be the same work as the repair of a town. The walk was quiet in the way of two people who have begun to practice speech together, not yet intimate, not yet fully honest, but no longer bare strangers. When they reached Main Street, the market's talk turned. A pair of children followed them at a cautious distance. An old woman, Mrs. Hale, who had called Caleb a miser at every other opportunity, paused in front of her stall and watched them pass, her face an unread ledger of accusation and curiosity. It would be, Rosemary thought, a long business to change a whole town's story about a man. But the first steps had been taken. The grove had been seeded, the school ledger adjusted, the ring on her finger a heavy, complicated symbol. She kept replaying Clara's knitting needle gaze and Caleb's awkward attempt to mimic a bird. She held, in a pocket of her heart, the image of their hands together, earth under the nails. The table in the grove would be set again tomorrow. There would be more rehearsals, of greetings, of household rituals, of the small things that make a pretense seem like a life. There would also be a reckoning at Silver Creek she could not yet name. On the threshold of these things, she felt both the brittle edge of fear and the slow, warm thread of something that might, with attention, become durable. A partnership formed not from the ease of love at first sight, but from the harder, truer labor of shared work and the deliberate choice to do right by others. If you enjoy twisty historical romances of unlikely love and second chances, stay with us for the rest of this tale. They read the letter together on the stair of Hawthorne House, the paper folding easily between Caleb's fingers, like a small thing that nevertheless held heat. William Foster's neat script suggested caution. The tone beneath it was a tremor. He had been a foreman long enough to know when a beam would betray a house and when a man would ignore a warning because coin and favor dangled on the other side. "It could be nothing," Caleb said, but the sentence carried the weight of someone who had known the ledger's capacity to unmake a town. It could be an overcaution. Rosemary wanted to believe the gentlest version of things. She had spent her life coaxing fragile remedies into health, and had learned in the process to heed small alarms before they became catastrophes. "We must see it for ourselves," she said. "If there is a rot, you know better than anyone that it will not stop at a single building." He folded the paper and pressed it into the inner pocket of his coat. Outside, Aspen Grove was coming alive under a slow rain. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and the dust that had traveled with years. He met her eyes with a look that shifted from calculation to something warmer, fraught, an acknowledgement that he did not want his name to be the thing that made men hurt. "Very well," he said. "We go at dawn." William Foster was waiting on the bank of Silver Creek, boots caked with mud, cheeks flushed from the cold. He had a face like one who had been accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, and when he looked at Caleb that way now, calm, urgent, Caleb's shoulders tightened into the posture of a man who felt responsibility like a physical weight. "There's been skiving on the northwest scaffold," Foster told them. "Nails not set, ledger split wrong, and the last delivery from the Sawyers was light on planks. Men complained. They said the bolts weren't right. I told them to stop. They said, stop and feed the family. You understand." Rosemary did understand. The small arithmetic of a family's survival often made corners appear where a foreman's conscience suggested none. She watched the two men speaking in the cold light of the creek, one whose senses measured the town in timbers, one who measured it in risk and reward. The creek cut through the valley like a seam, and the new row of workers' tenements rose by its edge, slate roofs, a line of windows, a scaffolding that shuddered when the wind found the wrong angle. They went over the scaffold with Foster.
Caleb touched wood with the kind of attention he had given Aspen Grove, the same hands that had lately learned to lift logs without haste, running his fingers along beams and asking small, practical questions. He spoke to the masons and the men who had dragged stone into place. He listened when they told him that a subcontractor had offered a softer rate and had promised speed above caution. He frowned and wrote nothing for a long time. "It must be made right," he said at last. "Every bolt checked. The subcontractor is to be suspended until we audit the lot, and men hurt will be cared for." His voice carried over the site like a decision put into motion. The men looked at him differently that afternoon, not the polite distance of a man who could pay, but the practical attentiveness afforded a leader who would remove a hazard.
They responded with small acts of gratitude, adjustments to lines, an offer of extra hands. Small acts recalibrate a man's reputation as surely as large ones. Rosemary felt it in the air. The town's eyes had been moving slow, studying the shape of change. When the scaffolding was reworked and the bolts reset, and they were both back at Hawthorne House with the smell of sawdust in their clothes, the shadow of the warning seemed to lift. Foster remained uneasy and would not be satisfied. "A ledger left unbalanced returns," he said softly to Caleb. "You need more than present repairs. You need a tally that cannot be evaded." Caleb made a decision then to convene the men who measured accounts for Hawthorne Trading. He would ensure that contracts were clearer, materials inspected before shipment, foremen empowered. It was, in the ledger of his life, a small correction. For Rosemary, it was a promise she meant to hold him to. The weeks that followed were a bustle. Aspen Grove took final shape under their hands. The benches planned and installed, a small wooden bridge put over a stretch of wet ground. The wedding, still meant as a performance that would preserve Hawthorne stock from being folded into the church, began to dissolve the clearer edges between pretense and something deeper. They rehearsed the procession one last time beneath the aspen leaves. Clara watched like a judge with a softened face. Dorothy and Thomas fussed over linens. Margaret Hawthorne sewed a sleeve with a careful hand and offered a sigh as if the work of mending could extend to mending reputations. Then came the rehearsal dinner. Clara insisted on it, and the town came in small clusters to watch the spectacle. The table set in the grove had grown a long, communal shape with benches and oil lamps sheltered by canopies. The meal was Rosemary's. She insisted on cooking for the table that had been their school of manners and work. There were loaves browned at the edges, bowls of stew, jars of pickled beets, and a simple pudding dotted with currants. Ornaments were minimal: a single sprig of rosemary in a cracked vase, and a small potted orchid on a stump, its stealthy bloom like an island of color. People were watching for falseness. They were primed for insult. The rehearsal began with the cautious steps that all such staged domesticities require. A handshake turned into a clasp, a forced intimacy held for the witness of relatives. Then, as the night grew thin and the aspen leaves made a susurration above them, a voice rose that was louder than a stage whisper. Catherine Whitrow, an old schoolteacher and a woman who took the currency of words seriously, rose from her chair and asked bluntly, "Miss Fletcher, will you tell us plainly whether you come to Mr. Hawthorne as a woman who has given herself of her own will, or as one who has been purchased to save a ledger?" There was a silence that felt like a held breath. The question had sting. It was the sort of thing towns say when they want to force truth into a corner. Rosemary felt the weight of it in her chest, the old fear that she might be read wrong and dismissed. Her hands, which had steadied many a poultice, had to find steadiness on this new thing, words in public. She rose slowly and set the small bowl she'd been holding down. Around her, the conversation fell away into an attentive hush. There was room then for truth, carefully chosen, not theatrical. "I did not come because I wanted to be sold," she said. "I came because a school depends on roofs not collapsing, because there are children who must learn and grow in warmth. I came because the village cannot afford the price Samuel took. I did not wish to be owned by any man, not even one who wields his holdings with generosity." She turned slightly and looked at Caleb. The lanterns painted their faces with honest light. "I came because I cannot let the small ones be without a place to sit and learn. If that makes me practical, then I will be practical. If it makes me compromised, then I will own that too. But I will not be reduced to an accusation made for the diversion of strangers." Those words landed like an unbending knife, precise and unyielding. Conversations rose in soft objection and then smoothed into murmur. Some faces reddened with embarrassment for having suspected her.
Others nodded in a slow, almost sorrowful recognition. She had acted for the common good. Clara watched with knitting needles paused. She had seen enough performances and enough honesty to know the shape of the thing. When she rose, it was not to berate nor to praise. She rose to give a verdict in a way only a matriarch could. There has been deceit in the world for many reasons, Clara said. Some lie for greed, some conceal fear. Miss Fletcher has been neither greedy nor cruel. She has shown herself to be a steward, and so should our family be steward in turn. She spoke then of the house and the stock, and the knot of decisions that had kept Hawthorne family from dissolving into public charity. I will make one adjustment, she announced, and the words made the air tight. I will transfer my shares to Caleb this evening. I will not allow my convictions to be used as an instrument to punish those who act in good faith. A murmur rose, and in the murmur some of the clipped suspicions slipped away. The transfer, formalized that night with old papers and Clara's small, decisive signature, made the marriage ostensibly unnecessary by the ledger's account, but both Rosemary and Caleb knew the truth. They had crossed a line of genuine care that the transfer could not unmake. They had begun to trust one another through the labor of caring for Aspen Grove, and through the small attentions that had replaced practiced intimacy with real concern. Rosemary felt an odd, dizzying release at Clara's action.
On paper, the debt was no longer the binding thing it had been. In the heart, it had not been the paper that bound them. Love, such as it was, had grown in the thin soil between shared labor and the steady smallness of considerate acts. The ring around Rosemary's finger felt heavier. It had become somehow not only a symbol of requirement, but of a mutual, quiet choice. The wedding that followed was simple beneath the aspen canopy. Guests came with boots still dusty. They sat on benches, and children ran, braiding ribbons into the pockets of draperies. Clara watched them with a prickled expression that might have been pride. When Caleb took Rosemary's hands and spoke the vows they had rehearsed until they felt less like lines and more like intentions, there was no applause when the ceremony was finished. There was something like a collective inhalation. The vows had been a script at first. They had been spoken into life by small acts. Later, in the hush after the service, Caleb pressed the new ring, plain hawthorn gold, into Rosemary's palm. I will not pretend, he said. This house is measured by ledgers that I cannot change alone. But the measure I will attempt to change is the kind that counts people. Time given, safety provided, debts forgiven. I will try, Miss Fletcher, to be the man who measures rightly. Her heart answered in the slow way of someone used to thinking in remedies rather than declarations. Then measure with me, she said. Not for show, not for ledger, but so that the school and the town and the people have shelter. They left for Wyoming as a brief detour from public expectation, a honeymoon of work and rest lying in a landscape different enough to feel like a small exile. Caleb had a small ranch there, not an estate, where sage scrub met a blue horizon. It was quiet in the way of uncounted places. The house was modest, with a porch that creaked like an apology and a stove that kept them near one another with the low hum of domestic labor. Wyoming was a space for confession without audience. Caleb told the story of his childhood at the Hawthorne homestead, a strict education in the details of trade, an apprenticeship in numbers and the invisible rules of legacy. He had been taught endurance and thrift, and he had been praised for keeping more that he spent. My father believed holding tight was the same as holding steady, he said, folding his hands in the light of a diminutive stove. He thought generosity could soften a man to ruin. He feared the world would take what was not guarded. Rosemary listened with the patience of one who tended slow things. People can be both careful and kind, she said. Keeping things safe is not the same as locking neighbors out. He smiled, and in the smile there was an exhale. I do not want to be the kind of keeper who only protects the pile, he said. I want to protect the people who live and work by it. They spoke of plans in those Wyoming evenings. No elaborate corporate language, but practical schemes dressed in the vernacular of the time. They proposed committees made up of master craftsmen and town elders to inspect building materials, a lodging plan for workers so families could sleep under the same roof, a relief fund to be used for medical care and temporary support in the event of accidents. Caleb listened and saw how easily the ideas became actions in Rosemary's mind, a practical woman who could make a soup and then see its ingredients as policy metaphors. He wrote notes with a steady hand, promising himself to enact them.
When they returned from the ranch, Colorado felt smaller and more urgent. The town welcomed them with pockets of curiosity and a small generosity of speech. But the ledger of consequence had not been closed. The scaffolding at Silver Creek, recently reworked, had been put to use, and on a mild morning, when the sun cut the cold air with a thin blade of heat, the sky seemed to be betrayed by a low, sudden sound, timber snapping, the shudder of a structure giving way. The collapse happened with the speed of a breath being taken wrong. Men shouted, a dust ghosted the creek, and the scaffolding buckled like a false promise. William Foster, who had warned of the slightest slack, was among those thrown from his perch. Others tumbled down, some were pinned under a web of broken planks. Nearby, carts overturned, and a cry rose that pressed against the valley, a raw sound of human harm. Rosemary's shop was not far. She ran with a satchel of herbs and bandages, driven by a practical impulse that had always been her first language. At the sight, she found the air heavy with dust and the taste of iron on the wind. Men lay groaning. One had a leg at an impossible angle. Another clutched his chest. The crew from Hawthorne Trading stood stunned, faces blanching like linen. Caleb arrived moments later, hair limp on his forehead, searching faces like a man trying to find the wrong entry in a self-same ledger. "Get the doctor," someone barked. There was no city hospital. There was the town physician, Pratt, who arrived with a bag of instruments and the kind of efficiency born of many emergencies. Caleb moved among the injured with hands that trembled. He was not merely reading the cost of a broken beam. He was seeing living, breathing people who had been harmed under contracts he had signed, under decisions he had made and had not yet reformed. For the first time in public crisis, he was not an aloof proprietor. He was a man confronting the fallibility of his operations. Rosemary worked by his side, applying poultices to reduce swelling, tying splints, putting cloth to wounds. She smelled the mix of resin and blood and felt the sharpness of fear in the valley. Foster's groan echoed. The man's hand, when Rosemary took it, was as calloused and large as any laborer's, and she steadied him with the same humility she afforded saplings.
The immediate aftermath was clotted with practicalities. The town demanded answers, and the demand hardened into accusations. Hawthorne men argued that an unvetted subcontractor was to blame, that shortcuts had been made without the company's consent. Others pointed to a culture where speed had been prized above safety. The ledger of responsibility, which Caleb had tried to balance in small ways, suddenly demanded a full accounting. Partners in Hawthorne Trading came with a new tone. They convened in the parlor at the house and spoke of reputational risk and legal exposure in a language Rosemary did not prefer. They urged Caleb to step aside, to take the blame in private so the company might avoid a spectacle that threatened its business. It was the oldest of prescriptions: sacrifice a leader to save the rest. Caleb listened as if the words were foreign currency. He thought perhaps that stepping down would expunge blame as ink can disguise a strike-through. He paced the parlor, the ring on Rosemary's finger catching the light and throwing small, accusing speckles on the carpet. In the quiet, he turned to her, no ledger between them now. "If I resign," he said, voice low as if the thought alone could break a window, "they will replace me. Will the new man be kinder? Will his men be safer? I fear stepping aside will be merely an act to prevent people seeing the work of repair." Rosemary stepped closer. "You would step aside to protect the house, or you would stay to repair it from within. Which will make the town safer?" He looked at her, and for a moment the man who had once proposed a year of arrangement seemed smaller than the one who must decide a path forward. "I do not know how to do this without being a man of consequence in the business," he said. "I do not know how to lead without the very authority they now question." "And who taught you that authority has only one shape?" Rosemary asked. "We have an opportunity, Caleb. If you walk now, you let the ledger close on its own. If you stay, you have to prove a different accounting, that the house will stand for the town and not merely for profit. Next week, you can speak. Today, we bandage. Tonight, you decide whether to face them." He sat then, like a man listening to himself for the first time. The town had always read him through the narrow lens of hoarding. That night, buried under the dust of the collapse and the smell of strained breath, he felt the shape of a different possibility. To remain, at the cost of all that pride demanded, and to take on the meticulous work of restitution. He rose at dawn and asked for a public meeting.
The town square filled as the word moved from door to door. Men with fresh bandages, wives with hollowed eyes, children who had watched fathers go to work. There were town elders, the merchant who had always counted coins with silence, and the women who sewed until their thumbs stung. Hawthorne men stood clustered like a fortification.
The air was white with expectation and the damp of a recent storm. When Caleb climbed the steps to the platform, many were ready to hurl him with words. They had called him a miser, and now they counted him among a new list: negligent, culpable, untethered. The mood was a heaving thing. He held the paper of his speaking notes, but set them aside after a moment, the practice of a man who realized that the ledger of words had to be replaced with the ledger of action. "People of Copper Creek," he began, and his voice was steadier than he felt. "I will not ask you for forgiveness on the basis of words alone. I will not hide behind lawyers and promises." He paused, meeting faces that had once turned aside when his name was spoken. "Hawthorne Trading has failed to protect those who worked with it. For that, I am responsible. For that, I am ashamed." A shout rose. Someone demanded a resignation. Another voice demanded immediate compensation. The town spoke in a chorus of pain, and the sound of it struck at Caleb like an actual blow. He took another breath and stepped further into what he was offering. "I will not resign," he said, and the crowd's reaction was immediate: anger and a suspicion that his refusal was another attempt at self-preservation. "I will make myself accountable." He called then for a committee of impartial men: 2 elders from Copper Creek, William Foster to represent the workers, Margaret Hawthorne to represent the family, and a pair of merchants from neighboring towns to review Hawthorne's materials and contracts. He committed Hawthorne funds for immediate relief of those injured and for families whose income had been lost. He promised full medical care and a living stipend for those unable to work while they recovered. He pledged to suspend dubious subcontractors, to appoint a safety foreman with authority to stop works until standards were met, and to open the company books to the committee's inspection. To many in the crowd, these were only words, pledges waiting for the crucible of action. But Caleb did not leave them to hover as mere rhetoric. He signed the first document there on the lectern, ink still damp, authorizing funds to be released to those in immediate need. He instructed his clerks to make out checks and handed them to the widows and the injured right on the platform. Then, in a move that surprised the town, he invited Foster to speak. Foster's gray face rippled with a slow, stubborn dignity. "If Mr. Hawthorne will sit with us and allow us a voice in how things are made safe," he said, "then we can help catch the things that used to slide by in silence. I ask for accountability, and I ask for work repaired. The men do not want charity, they want fairness." This was not a grand redemption performed in a single public act. It was a practical unspooling of trust. Money for immediate care, policy changes, oversight. It was the ledger recalibrated to account for human consequence instead of profit alone.
And it was Caleb, standing in front of the town, taking a responsibility in action. He did not ask to be absolved. He asked to be judged by the measure of his labor. Rosemary watched from the edges, not a silent bystander, but a woman whose practical knowledge of mending small things translated into a sense for public restoration. After Caleb's speech, when the crowd had dispersed into a chorus of unsettled murmurs and guarded praise, she went among those injured, speaking quietly and practically. She doused one man's fevered brow with a cooling cloth, set some herbs to soak for a bitters that eased stomachs, and organized a rota of women to bring bread. Her presence was a demonstration as cogent as any proclamation. Care is not an abstraction. The committee convened. They reviewed ledgers and shipment records, and in a few pointed names, they uncovered a pattern. A subcontractor had indeed skimmed planks and substituted substandard bolts in the haste to earn a contract. Several men in the chain were guilty of negligence. Caleb authorized the committee to dismiss those responsible and to refer serious malfeasance to a neighboring county's magistrate for legal action. He restructured the contracting process. No subcontractor would be accepted without reference from a panel of local craftsmen. He named William Foster as a foreman with the authority to halt supplies and demand inspection. He agreed to match the town's funds for a relief fund that would be held in trusteeship by the committee, money to be used only for medical care and temporary wages. These were not miraculous absolutions. They were binding, bureaucratic, and most importantly, public. Caleb placed ink on paper,
and his signature was a visible stitch in the town's torn fabric. He did not ask for it to be believed. He allowed the town to measure it. The weeks of weathered work that followed were a mix of compassion and labor. Men returned to damaged scaffolds with a more careful rhythm. Materials were tested by trusted hands, and prices renegotiated to ensure fair trade for safer goods. There was grief. Some men had injuries that would alter the arc of their work, and there was an ache that memory brings when the dead are named, where the maimed cannot lift a hammer as before. Rosemary visited each household with poultices, bread, and a pocketful of small remedies. She stayed to hear stories of mornings before a collapse, and of families forgetting to ask for help until the ledger forced the need. Her presence steadied many a trembling heart. She organized women into a support circle to stitch clothes, mend tools, and keep the relief chest in order. Meanwhile, Caleb worked with a new steadiness. He walked the town more openly, talking to men at the blacksmiths and to mothers at the school. He apprenticed himself to a kind of listening that had not comprised his ledger before.
He met with the committee every week and began to write down the changes he would implement. A workers' council that included men like Foster, a formal set of contracts with written assurance of safety standards, an on-site inspector with authority to cancel a day's work, relief protocols for injured men and their families. He also pledged to fund a more lasting project, an initiative he and Rosemary had sketched quietly in Wyoming, a place where the town could house its labor with dignity and where the commons would be a seed for a broader ethic of stewardship. The project they decided upon, called Rosemary Commons in an awkward moment of public gratitude, would be built on a parcel the Hawthorne family had long used for timber stores at the edge of town. It would be a mixed settlement, small cottages for workers and larger rooms set aside for families who had lost homes, with communal gardens and a common house where food would be prepared, skills taught, and mutual aid arranged. Hawthorne Trading would provide the funds, but the management would be entrusted to a council that included a worker representative, a widowed mother, an elder from the town, and 2 Hawthorne officials. This last clause was crucial. No single hand would hold sole control. The building of the commons became a work of public reclamation. Men who had been menders of scaffolds learned carpentry under better terms. Women taught weaving and preservation methods in a small outbuilding. Children learned to come and go through a courtyard that smelled like rosemary in time. The first rows of cottages rose with a neighborly sturdiness, their roofs thatched to match the town style, rather than to market gentry's architecture. A small center was built with a long table that Clara insisted should be reclaimed from an old Hawthorne banquet table, a heavy thing that looked like many hands had tested it. They sanded it until it shone with use rather than with polish. The table's scars became a testimony to the kind of life they wanted to host. The opening of Rosemary Commons was a public event. The town came in clusters, those who had once scoffed openly at Caleb's frugality, the very men he had offended when he tightened a contract and held firm on a bid, the injured workers and their families. The Commons was not ostentatious, it was honest and practical, with the smell of bread in the air and a garden which Rosemary had planned to use as both a food source and a training ground. The table in the common house, Clara's reclaimed centerpiece, was set out for a communal meal. The sky that morning was a bright, careful blue, and the aspen leaves, which had seen both rehearsal and wedding, trembled as if applauding. Caleb stood at the head of the long table. People watched him with the caution of those who had been wrong before. He spoke briefly, but this time he did not speak alone.
He gestured to the band of workers who had been injured and to their families, inviting them to sit. Then he did something that silenced the town's murmurs more effectively than any speech could. He sat down among them. He did not sit at an elevated head seat with a goblet's height of purpose. He sat shoulder to shoulder with Foster and with men who had once been anonymous names on a ledger. Children pushed their chairs close, and widows took seats where the light fell soft. The commons filled quickly, and soon the long table was populated by people who had previously dined in separate rooms. It became a tableau of inclusion. The very workers who had been exposed by neglect were now eating the same stew served in the same bowls. A woman who had been one of the harshest scorners of Hawthorne's rumored stinginess watched him across the table. Her lips parted, and her eyes filled with a compassionate sort of astonishment. "He opened his door to them," she said to the woman beside her. "He sits with them. I did not think such a thing possible." "You did not know him," the other replied, "and perhaps you did not want to." Rosemary moved through the crowd like a lullaby. She brought bowls to a child with a bandage at his brow. arranged extra loaves for a family of 5, and placed a sprig of rosemary in the center pot where an orchid had been that morning, its single bloom now nestled beside a small pot of thyme. The motif of the table, simple in its provision, rich in what it represented, had become a living proof. Clara, who had been watchful from a corner, caught Rosemary's eye. The old woman rose and tapped a spoon lightly against a plate to call for silence. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the small, clipped thing of court. It was solid and sweet with approval. "This is how a house should behave," she said. "It should provide. It should be measured by the number of warm bellies and dry beds it secures." The murmurs around her shifted into quiet applause. People who had once called Caleb miser watched him serve bread to a boy with a fresh scar and hand a cup to a woman whose husband had been hospitalized. He did not make a show of these acts. He performed them quietly, as if the ritual of feeding might contain the truest work of repair. The opening became the narrative pivot the town had been waiting for. They saw with their own eyes, those who ate at his table were not imagined beneficiaries, but the injured and the hungry, the ordinary laborers and the children who had once learned beside a cold stove. The table made the truth visible in a way gossip could not. You can, notoriously, say a man is tight with his purse until you see him give it away with his own hands, and that act dissolves a rumor faster than any rebuttal. Photographs were not a part of this time as they would be later, but the images took root in the people who were present. Caleb carrying a tray, a child laughing as he bit into bread, Clara's small smile like a seal.
Those who had once taught children to hush at the Hawthorne name now watched the man pass a bowl and found, painfully, that their own narratives had been hasty. The rumor had fit the town. Reality, complex and messy, forced them to learn a new story. Rosemary sat at Caleb's left. They ate in the ordinary way people who have done practical work eat, slowly, with mouths and hands occupied, letting conversation rise in fragments. They spoke in the quiet between courses, of new garden terraces, of a training program for apprentices, of a small schoolroom in the commons where herbs would be grown as a lesson in public health. They planned, in the codified language of those who act rather than declaim, a schedule for continuing repairs that would give men steady work rather than sporadic contracts. There were difficult conversations, too. Some in the town demanded stricter punishments for those who had skimmed their screws. Others wanted immediate dismissal of Hawthorne Trading's leadership. Caleb answered with the practicalities he had risen to accept. "We cannot simply hang men and walk away," he said gently. "If we root out the corruption, we must also create systems to prevent it. We must employ oversight that is not Hawthorne alone." The Commons, over months, became more than a shelter. It became a place where the town learned new economies, a system of mutual support that did not mimic the old top-down charity, but wove people into a fabric where help was expected and reciprocated. Workshops taught carpentry and weaving. A small infirmary run partly by Rosemary and partly by a visiting physician offered care without the imposition of fees that might starve a family into silence. The Hawthorne funds, while generous and necessary, were not the heart of the Commons. They were the initial impetus. The heart was the people who worked there and took ownership. Public perception shifted slowly. Conversations at the market changed from singular accusations into something like a ledger of the whole town's life. A child who once refused to speak Caleb's name now called him by his full name in passing because the child had seen him carry soup to a family and listen to a father's tale. The blacksmith who had once crossed the street to avoid his carriage now stood in the doorway and offered a hand. Not everyone forgave readily. There were still those who held fast to earlier judgments and some who resented Hawthorne for the past. Rosemary did not expect all hearts to change overnight. What she did expect was the slow accrual of evidence, the common steady provision, the weekly committee meetings, the visible care given to those who had been harmed. Change as currency, she knew, was not rhetoric, but consistent, repeated acts. Clara, watching all of this with a small, secreted delight, began to take an interest in more than the ledger. She would come to the Commons and sit at the table, knitting and passing soup. People would glance and then relax. At night, she would sometimes produce the cedar chest she had once kept closed and opened a drawer of ribbons, tokens of an earlier tenderness, and placing one into Rosemary's steady palm, she would say, "For keeping our table full." These were small intimacies that resealed the social fabric in a way Clara liked to call repair. In private, Caleb and Rosemary found their life deepening without dramatic gestures. Their love was not a sudden conflagration, but a slow warming. Shared coffee at dawn, a hand pressed to a back during a parish meeting, a whispered apology when a small bureaucratic decision required them to argue. There were still moments of old habit, Caleb's instinct to guard holdings and Rosemary's fierce need for autonomy, but they learned to negotiate, to draft agreements modeled not on power, but on reciprocity. They became partners, not in the sense of an old marriage contract that bound and owned, but in the sense of people who shared work and bore consequence together. When a child in Pine Ridge broke his arm falling from a newly repaired fence, Caleb did not write a check and keep his distance. He sat in the hospital corridor late into the night, holding a hot cup of tea while the mother slept and counting the small things that would be required: care for the arm, tutoring for missed lessons, wages to be replaced. He had learned through the collapse and the comments what stewardship might require, a labor of attention that could not be performed by ledger alone. Rumors shrank when deeds grew larger than gossip. The town, once rushing to label a man by distance, had now to accept complexity. They had the image of him sitting at a table serving stew to a man with a bandaged hand. They had the record of funds distributed in public. They had the commons where their own neighbors lived and worked. This evidence was harder to ignore than idle insult. The story of Caleb Hawthorne, once a convenient tale of stinginess, became a longer, truer arc in the mouths of the people who had been touched by it. In the square and in the tavern, they told parts of it with new endings, not of a miser's wealth hoarded, but of a man who chose to do reparation and then to persist in it. Children learned a different lesson, that power had obligations, and that restitution could be made if people were willing to act. Years later, when the commons ran smoothly and the school stove in Pine Ridge no longer shivered in winter, the town still remembered the collapse at Silver Creek. They remembered it because memory had a way of learning by recalling the lesson learned. A covenant signed in front of witnesses, funds dispersed in public, a committee installed with oversight and teeth. They knew, too, that those who had been hurt were not merely numbers on a ledger. They were the people who sat at Caleb's table now, without fear or distance.
One late summer evening, as the sun laid a slow gold over Aspen Grove, Rosemary and Caleb sat at that same long table in the commons with a quiet contentment that was not sentimental but earned. Clara sat opposite them, her hands moving rhythmically over a small piece of knitting. Margaret had brought a pie and placed it on the table without fanfare. Children chased each other at the periphery of the yard, shrieking with a healthy abandon that meant the place had become safe and full. Rosemary looked at Caleb with a fullness that had grown in contingency and trial. "Do you ever think about how quick people were to name you?" she asked. He sipped from a cup and let the memory of the early days settle like a soft ash. "They did not know me then," he said. "They did not know how tied my name was to habit and fear. I do not expect all to forget, but I hope what we have done will be enough to change the ledger the next time someone asks a man's worth." Clara's knitting slowed and then stopped. She looked at them with the small mischief of a woman who has outlived many predictions. "They will remember you by the sound of the table," she said. "They will remember the noise of children and the clatter of spoons where once there was only silence. That is better than any coin." A hush came over the table, not imposed, but born of the recognition that the scene was in a way an answer to the town's old talk. The table had become a living testament to the change. Those who had eaten at Caleb's table were not the imagined beneficiaries of philanthropic show, but the town itself, the very people who had once pointed and whispered. Outside, a small woman, one who had once declared Caleb tight with his coin, brought a bouquet of wild flowers and placed them at the center of the table. "You were right to feed people here," she said simply. "They need bread, and now they have it." When the evening wound down and the lamplight softened, Caleb reached across the table and took Rosemary's hand. Her palm was warm, calloused in the places where the work of herbs and hands had left its mark. He slipped his fingers through hers, as if rediscovering a familiar groove. "I cannot promise we will always be right," he said, "but I can promise that our house will be judged by the number of meals shared and not by the coins hidden away." "Then we will keep this table full," she replied,
not so the town will forgive us easily, but so that we do not forget why we began." They stood then, and Clara rose with them. The old woman reached into her pockets and drew out a small ribbon rung with years. She placed it on the table, where the orchid, now in full bloom, nodded as if in agreement. "Plant this somewhere the children will see it," she instructed. "Let them know that a small bloom can be kept if you water it. Let them know the shape of repair."
The town, in time, learned to say a new thing when they spoke of Caleb Hawthorne in the market. They used to call him a miser. They would say in the softer voice of a person remembering a story told to children. But then they watch his hands. They would pause, smile, and add, "He learned to feed his neighbors," and that made him a different kind of rich. Rosemary and Caleb watched the children from the doorway of the commons the following morning, sunlight running along the boards and the air smelling like damp earth and newly braided rope. The table inside was set for breakfast with the plainness of a life that had steadied into a new rhythm. People came, not out of spectacle, but because people go where they are known to be cared for. Clara, knitting in her chair, gave them a small, knowing look. "You never were only a burden," she said once, quietly, as if remarking on a finished recipe. "You were a chance. That matters." In the years that followed, the Hawthorne name carried a longer story among people passing through Copper Creek. They told it sometimes as a caution and sometimes as an example. A man once called stingy learned to be measured by the measure of his table. They told their children that leadership has duties and that restitution requires not only money, but consistent work and the courage to remain present. When the final plate was cleared from a dinner at the Commons and the lamp swung low, Caleb and Rosemary would sometimes sit under the aspen trees and take stock of the small ledger they kept of daily acts, a repaired roof, a child's fever eased, a day's wages returned. They did not need the town to call them saints or to remove every remembered slight. They wanted only the slow recompense of steady goodness, a table kept open, a garden tended, a house that served the town rather than only the family. One evening, as the sun slid down the valley and the aspen leaves gave a last rustling applause, Caleb and Rosemary walked to a small bench and sat in companionable silence. The orchid, now potted in a corner of the Commons window, held its bloom like a small, stubborn proof that delicate things can be kept. "Do you regret the bargain at the shop?" she asked him, the question more a meditation than an accusation. He considered the long thread of events, the letter to Samuel that never came, the rehearsals and the collapse, the long, slow work that had followed. He thought of Clara's ribbon, the ledger entries turned into hands given, not for display, but for repair. "No," he said at last, "not the way I might have expected. The bargain began as a ledger adjustment and became a long practice." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and under the old aspen canopy, their figures made a small, private silhouette. "Then let us keep practicing," she whispered. At the Commons that night, the long table stood empty but for a small bouquet and a pair of cups.
The town had found its rhythm, not because of a single act, but because a man and a woman continued to show up, to tend, and to give. The rumor of a miser became, slowly and stubbornly, part of a larger story. A man who had the chance to hoard and instead chose to feed, practically, imperfectly, and with attention. If this story moved you, like and subscribe to hear more tales of unlikely second chances. And tell us in the comments, who surprised you most?